The Forgotten Streets of Southgate. It was an ordinary afternoon in Southgate, the kind that could be overlooked by most as just another day in a town that had long since fallen out of the spotlight. The streets buzzed with the familiar hum of passing traffic, the distant sound of chatter, and the occasional bark of a dog. But there was an unspoken weight in the air, something people who lived here knew too well but chose to ignore. It was as if the town itself had become tired, worn out, and burdened by the invisible scars left behind from years of neglect. Madison Miller, despite being only 8 years old, walked with a certain kind of purpose that far exceeded her years. Her golden hair, streaked with strands of dirt and sweat, fell over her forehead as she made her way down the cracked pavement. Her small hands clutched the edges of a worn teddy bear, one that seemed to offer her some comfort as the world around her felt cold and distant. Her eyes, though young, told a story of someone far older than her age. There was a weariness in them, an understanding of things that most children should never have to comprehend. She had lived through more in her short life than anyone should, and yet she carried herself with a determination that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. There was something deeply unsettling about the way she walked. It wasn't the carefree gait of a child. It was the stride of someone who had learned too soon that the world doesn't always play fair. Her destination was the old police station at the end of Main Street, a place that had seen its better days. The once white bricks had faded to a dull gray, and the windows, though kept clean, reflected nothing but the fading light of the setting sun. It wasn't a place where people sought help willingly, but today Madison was different. She had something she needed to say, something that, in her heart, she knew could change everything. As she reached the doors of the station, she hesitated for a moment. It wasn't fear that made her pause, but something else, something that made her realize that once she stepped inside, there would be no turning back. The weight of her knowledge pressed down on her small shoulders, but she didn't let it stop her. She had to do this. The door creaked open, and Madison stepped inside. The cool, sterile air of the police station greeted her, the walls lined with old photographs and plaques, a silent testament to the years of service this place had provided. Behind the desk, Officer Blake Montgomery sat, his face lined with the kind of fatigue that came only after years of listening to the same stories, the same complaints, the same missing persons reports that never led anywhere. Blake didn't notice Madison at first. He was too focused on the papers in front of him, sorting through a pile of reports, each one blurring into the next. But the soft sound of her small feet against the floor caught his attention, and he looked up. At first, he thought she might be lost, or that she had wandered in by mistake. But there was something about her that stopped him in his tracks. Her eyes, steady, unblinking, and wise beyond her years, told him that this wasn't just another child looking for help. The silence stretched between them for a moment before Madison spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "I know where my sister is." Blake blinked, caught off guard by her words. He leaned forward, the weariness of his long day momentarily forgotten. "What do you mean, honey?" he asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper as he tried to meet her gaze. He kneeled to her level, unsure of what to make of this tiny girl, standing in front of him with such certainty in her eyes. Madison's eyes never wavered, and in that moment, Blake felt a chill run down his spine. "She's waiting for me," Madison said again, her voice stronger this time, as if she were speaking a truth that she had known for longer than anyone could understand. Blake's brows furrowed, his mind racing. He had seen it all. Children in distress, frantic parents, scared witnesses. But this was different. This was not the pleading of a frightened child. It was the calm of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about, as though she had been to places Blake could never fathom. "Your sister, Lily," Blake asked carefully, trying to keep the skepticism out of his voice. "She's been missing for over a month, Madison. Are you sure you know where she is?" Madison nodded, a quiet but certain movement. "I know where she is," she repeated, her words steady, unwavering. "But you have to listen to me. You have to promise me something first." Blake's heart skipped a beat. The air in the room suddenly felt thicker, more oppressive, as if the weight of her words was pushing down on him. He knew that this could be just another desperate cry for help, but something about her presence, her certainty, made him hesitate. "I promise," he said, his voice low but resolute. His training kicked in, and he knew he had to keep his focus. But deep down, something was stirring inside him. Something that told him this was not a simple missing child case. Madison looked up at him with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Promise me," she whispered, "that you won't let them stop me. I need to find her, before it's too late." Blake's heart raced as Madison's words settled in his mind. The room felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. He had seen his fair share of tragedies in his line of work, but this felt different. Something about this child, about the way she spoke, about the weight of her plea, made him feel as though he was standing on the edge of something far darker than he could have imagined. He had no idea where this path would lead, but in that moment, he made a silent promise to Madison. He would follow her. He would do whatever it took to find her sister, even if he didn't understand the full extent of what was happening. Through the shadows of Southgate, Blake stood up slowly, his mind racing with a million thoughts. It was rare for a detective, especially one like him, to be caught off guard. He had been trained for nearly every kind of scenario, from the mundane to the extreme. Yet Madison's words, spoken with the certainty of someone who had seen more than any child should, left him unsettled. "I'll help you," Blake said quietly, his voice firm despite the unease bubbling in his chest. He had seen children in distress before, but something about Madison, the way she carried herself, the unspoken gravity of her words, was unlike anything he had ever experienced. "But first, we need to make sure you're safe." Madison shook her head, her expression unwavering. "I'm not scared," she said softly. "I need you to find Lily before they do." Blake's breath hitched, and for a moment, he hesitated. Who was she talking about? Who were they? His thoughts were interrupted by Madison, turning toward the door. Without another word, she walked out of the station with Blake trailing behind her, his heart racing in his chest. The streets of Southgate were quieter now, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. There was a sense of finality in the air, like the world was holding its breath. Madison's small figure led the way, her pace measured but confident, as though she had walked this path countless times before. Blake found himself following her, unsure of what he was stepping into but unwilling to let this little girl walk alone through the darkness that seemed to stretch out before them. They passed familiar streets, run-down houses, corner stores with their windows boarded up, and abandoned lots where children used to play. It was a place Blake knew all too well, a place where hope had been forgotten by most. But Madison seemed unaffected by the grim reality of Southgate. She walked with purpose, as though she knew something the rest of them didn't. As they reached the end of the street, Blake noticed the change. The buildings grew older here, more dilapidated. The air seemed heavier, the streets quieter. It was as though they had entered a different world, one that felt separate from the rest of Southgate, a place where time had stopped, where memories had been buried under the weight of years gone by. Then they stopped in front of a house. Blake's eyes narrowed as he looked at it. The building was ancient, the paint peeling from the walls, the windows dark and uninviting. The door was slightly ajar, a faint creak in the wind making it sway just enough to reveal a sliver of what lay inside. "This is where she is," Madison whispered, her small voice barely audible against the stillness of the street. "I'll show you, but you have to promise." Blake's stomach tightened. There was something unsettling about the house, something in the way it stood there, so silent and alone. He turned to look at Madison, who was staring at the house with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "I promise," Blake said, his voice a little hoarser than he intended. There was no turning back now. Madison pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of decay clung to the walls. Blake could feel the chill in the air as he stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. His eyes strained in the dim light, trying to make sense of the shadows that seemed to stretch out in every direction. Madison led the way, her steps light but determined. Her eyes flicked from room to room, her gaze fixed as if she were searching for something or someone among the darkness. Blake followed her through the narrow hallway, his senses on high alert, every nerve in his body screaming that something wasn't right. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something unseen was lurking just beyond the edges of the darkness. As they reached the back of the house, Blake's breath caught in his throat. The room was empty. There were no signs of Lily, no discarded toys, no traces of a child who had once played here. But as Blake stepped further inside, his eyes were drawn to the floor. Scratches marred the wooden surface, and a broken chair lay discarded in the corner, its legs twisted in a grotesque manner. The air was thick with the heavy scent of something long forgotten, something that had been left to rot in silence. Madison's voice trembled as she stepped closer, her small hands gripping the doorframe for support. "She was here," she whispered. "I swear it." Blake kneeled down, his fingers brushing the floor as he tried to make sense of the scene before him. The coolness of the air shifted, and for a brief moment, he felt a presence, something unseen, something that seemed to watch them from the shadows. He stood up quickly, his pulse quickening, and turned to look at Madison, who had not moved since they entered the room. "Why are you here, Madison?" Blake whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He needed answers, something to explain the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in his chest. "Who else knows about this place?" Madison's eyes locked with his, and for a moment, it felt like the world around them had stopped. There was a weight in her gaze that Blake couldn't understand, a depth to it that went far beyond the innocence of her age. Her lips parted as though she were about to speak, but no words came. Before Blake could press her further, a faint sound echoed from somewhere deep within the house. It was soft at first, so faint it could have been his imagination. But then it came again. A muffled cry, fragile and broken, like the sound of a child in pain. Blake froze. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, the room seemed to close in on him. His breath caught in his throat as the cry echoed once more, this time louder, more desperate. "It's her," Blake whispered, his voice barely audible. His instincts screamed at him to move, to go to the source of the cry, but Madison's small hand shot out, gripping his sleeve with surprising strength. "No," she said softly, her voice strained with fear. "Don't go there." Blake turned to face her, confusion and concern flooding his chest. "What do you mean?" "We have to find her. She's so close." Madison's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and urgency. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're waiting. They've been waiting." The words hung in the air, heavy and chilling, like an unseen weight pressing down on them. Blake's mind raced, and for the first time in his career, he felt completely out of his depth. Something was wrong. Something far darker than anything he had ever encountered. "Who's waiting?" Blake asked, his voice low and fearful. Madison looked up at him, her eyes filled with a wisdom he couldn't comprehend. She opened her mouth to speak, but before the words could leave her lips, another cry echoed through the house, a sound so desperate, so filled with pain, that it nearly broke Blake's composure. Without thinking, Blake moved toward the sound, his body moving on instinct. But as he reached the hallway, a shiver ran down his spine. The shadows seemed to move, to stretch out with a life of their own, twisting and contorting in ways that didn't make sense. "Blake, don't," Madison pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. The truth that waited. Blake's footsteps echoed through the house, the sound unnatural in the thick silence that surrounded them. The shadows, like sentinels, seemed to stretch further with each step he took, as though they were pulling him deeper into their grasp. Madison's pleas faded behind him, swallowed by the darkness, but the urgency in her voice hung in the air, weighing on his every move. He couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close to finding her. He had to find Lily. The cry, faint but unmistakable, pierced through the silence again, closer this time. Blake's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse quickening as he reached the end of the hallway. The door at the far end was cracked open, its dark interior inviting him into the unknown. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to listen to Madison, to heed the growing sense of danger that crawled up his spine. But his feet moved forward, driven by something deeper than logic or fear. Lying in the corner was a broken doll, its limbs twisted and mangled, its eyes hollow and empty. It was a grotesque parody of a child's toy, a haunting reminder of innocence lost. Blake recoiled, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. And then, from the other side of the room, a soft voice called out, "Blake, Blake, you shouldn't have come." The voice wasn't Madison's. It wasn't Lily's. It was a voice Blake didn't recognize, cold, distant, and almost otherworldly. Blake turned toward the sound, his heart pounding in his chest, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure he couldn't comprehend. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes, his face hidden beneath a hood. He was tall, thin, and unnaturally still. There was something about him, something that didn't belong. His eyes, when they met Blake's, were empty, devoid of any humanity. There was no malice, no anger, just an eerie, hollow emptiness that sent a chill down Blake's spine. "You shouldn't be here," the man repeated, his voice an echo in the silence of the room. Blake took a step back, his mind racing. What was happening? Who was this man? And what did he mean? "You shouldn't be here." "Where is she?" Blake demanded, his voice shaky but firm. He had to stay focused. He had to find Lily. This wasn't about the man. This was about the girl. His mind screamed for answers, but all he could hear was the faint cry of a child, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. "She's not here," the man said quietly. "She never was." Blake's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" "Lily's missing. She's in danger. You have to help me." The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hand slowly, pointing toward the broken doll in the corner. Blake's eyes followed the motion, and for the first time, he saw something that took his breath away. The doll was no longer just a doll. It was a child. A small, fragile girl, curled up in a fetal position, her eyes wide open, staring into the void. The figure in the corner was Lily. She was there, but not in the way Blake had imagined. She was trapped in a place beyond the physical world, a place between life and death, a place that couldn't be touched by his hands or his words. "This isn't real," Blake whispered, his voice breaking. "This can't be real." The man stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "It's not about reality. It's about the truth that waits. The truth that's always been here, hiding in plain sight." Blake stumbled back, his mind struggling to keep up with what was unfolding before him. What truth? What did he mean? Madison's voice echoed from behind him, a soft whisper that barely reached his ears. "They were always here," she said, her tone almost wistful. "They'd been waiting for us all along." Blake turned to look at her, but what he saw wasn't the Madison he had been following through the streets. This Madison was different, older, wiser, as though the years had passed through her in a way that had left her untouched by time. She wasn't a child anymore. She was something else, something ancient. "The truth," Madison continued, "is that we've all been running from it, from the darkness, from what we don't want to see, but you can't outrun it. You can only face it." Blake's mind reeled as he tried to comprehend what she was saying. The darkness. What was she talking about? "You see, Blake," Madison said, her eyes locking onto his with a knowing gaze, "Lily isn't lost. She never was. She was always here, in this place, waiting for us to understand, waiting for someone to hear her." Blake shook his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. But she's just a little girl." How could she? How could any of this? She's not lost. Madison interrupted, her voice gentle yet unwavering. She's found. And so are you. And in that moment, Blake understood. It wasn't about saving Lily. It wasn't about finding her in the way he had imagined. The truth had always been there, hidden beneath the layers of fear and uncertainty. It was about accepting the truth of what had happened, of what had been happening all along. It was about facing the darkness that lurked inside them all and finding the courage to let it go. Madison, with her eyes full of understanding and her heart full of grace, had led him to this place, not to solve a mystery, but to uncover a deeper truth. The missing child, the lost sister, the desperate search, they were all part of a larger story, a story of healing, of growth, and of facing the things that had once seemed too terrifying to confront. The man, who had never truly been a man, stood silently by as Blake took one final steady breath. The weight lifted from his chest, and for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. Peace not because the case had been solved, but because he had learned something more important. Blake looked down at Madison, her small figure standing beside him, and realized that in helping her, he had helped himself. Together, they had faced the darkness. Together, they had found the light. And as the shadows that had once surrounded him receded, Blake knew that he would never forget this moment. The moment he had finally understood what it meant to truly listen. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.